Out of the car. James blinked, trying to process what he was hearing. Suspicious? I've been here for maybe 5 minutes, officer. I've parked here for years to pick up my daughter. There's no need to be. The officer's tone sharpened, cutting him off. Step out of the car, now. The demand was so sudden, so forceful, that James felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't sure what was happening, but it felt wrong. He glanced over his shoulder at Amara, who had noticed the commotion and was starting to walk in their direction, her face filled with concern. He had to stay calm, he couldn't let her see him lose control. He slowly reached for the door handle, glancing once more at the officer. Sir, I don't understand what's going on. I haven't done anything wrong. His voice was steady but laced with confusion and growing anxiety. You're not making this any easier, the officer muttered, grabbing hold of the door and yanking it open. I said step out. James stepped out of the car, his hands slightly trembling but trying to keep his composure. The officer was close now, towering over him, and he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. What had started as a routine stop was quickly spiraling into something much more serious, and he didn't know why. Amara had reached the sidewalk now, her little legs taking her toward her father with increasing speed. Daddy, what's happening? Why are the cops here? Her voice, sweet and innocent, cracked slightly as she spoke, betraying her unease. The second officer, a shorter woman with a stern face, now moved to the other side of the car, looking inside, her eyes scanning for anything that could justify their actions. Meanwhile, the first officer continued to look James up and down, his gaze cold and assessing. Sir, I'm going to need you to stay where you are. We're conducting a search, the officer said, motioning to the woman officer to start checking the vehicle. You might be involved in something more serious than you realize. James felt a chill run down his spine. This is ridiculous. I'm just here to pick up my daughter. I don't understand why you're treating me like this. Amara, now visibly frightened, took a few more steps forward. Daddy, are you okay? She reached out a hand toward him. The officer ignored her presence, his focus entirely on James. Keep your hands where I can see them, he ordered. James' heart raced. He couldn't comprehend why this was happening, but he knew one thing. For sure, Amara was watching. He couldn't allow this situation to escalate, not in front of her. He needed to remain calm, though every fiber of his being screamed to challenge the officers. Still, the sight of Amara's anxious face kept him grounded. Please, James said, his voice now pleading. She's just a little girl. Can you please explain why you're doing this? Before the officer could respond, Michelle, James' wife, appeared in the distance. She had been delayed at work that day and was just arriving to pick up Amara, unaware of the tense scene unfolding. Her gaze shifted from James to the officers, and her expression shifted from confusion to anger. What's going on here? Michelle called out, her voice carrying with a sense of authority that immediately caught the officer's attention. One of the officers quickly turned to her. Ma'am, we're just questioning your husband. He's been acting suspicious, and we need to make sure everything is in order. Michelle's eyes narrowed. Suspicious? My husband was simply picking up our daughter from school. There is no reason for you to be treating him like this. James looked at Michelle with a mixture of relief and anxiety. She was always the voice of reason in their family, but he could tell that the situation was rapidly getting out of hand. He could see the officer's dismissive look toward Michelle, the condescension in his voice as he said, "We'll handle this, ma'am. Please step back." Michelle's face flushed with anger. "No, I will not step back. You have no reason to treat my husband this way." The tension between them built, thick and palpable. Amara stood frozen, clutching her father's jacket sleeve. James could feel the weight of the moment, the sensation that everything was spinning out of control. Then, just as it seemed the situation might erupt into chaos, the second officer, who had been quietly observing from the other side of the car, spoke up. "Hold on," she said, her voice suddenly sharp. "We've received a report from dispatch about this vehicle. Seems like there's been a mix-up. We've got to." But before she could finish her sentence, a third car arrived on the scene. Another officer, one who seemed older and perhaps more experienced, stepped out of the vehicle. He took one look at the situation and, without a word, gestured for the first two officers to step back. James, still shaken and confused, didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. The new officer approached him calmly, his eyes softening as he took in the scene. "James Mitchell, right?" "Yes," James replied, his voice still tense. "Sorry for the confusion," the officer said. "There's been a mix-up. The report was for a different vehicle." He paused, glancing at the two officers who had initially stopped James. "I'll take care of this." James looked at Michelle, who was now standing beside him, and nodded as if to say, "It's okay." But inside, his mind was racing. He had just been harassed for no reason, dragged into something that didn't make sense. "Thanks," James muttered, though his voice was still shaky. He couldn't quite believe what had just happened. As the officers slowly started to disperse, Michelle put a comforting hand on James' shoulder. "We need to get home. We're not doing this here," she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet fury that James knew well. They turned to leave, but as they walked toward their car, James couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was lurking beneath the surface of this incident. The officers might have walked away, but the questions would linger. Why had this happened? And more importantly, what would happen next? As James and Michelle slowly made their way to their car, the tension in the air was still thick, almost suffocating. Amara, clutching her father's hand, stayed close to them, her wide eyes darting between the officers who were now retreating and the crowd of onlookers who were beginning to disperse. The sounds of distant car engines and murmured conversations filled the silence as the family walked in stunned silence toward the sedan. James kept his gaze straight ahead, his heart still pounding in his chest. The chaos of just a few moments ago was still fresh in his mind. How had things escalated so quickly? He tried to push the thoughts away, focusing instead on getting his family safely home. But Michelle's voice broke through his thoughts. "We need to talk about this," she said, her tone firm, though there was a slight edge of frustration in it. "This isn't just going to go away." James didn't respond immediately. He wanted to, but his emotions were a tangled mess, anger, confusion, disbelief, all battling for dominance. His mind kept replaying the officer's cold demeanor, the way he had been treated like a criminal, the way they had demanded he step out of the car for no reason other than his skin color. The more he thought about it, the more the rage began to build in his chest. But what could he do? He was just one man, one father, trying to pick up his daughter from school. They reached the car, and James opened the door, allowing Michelle and Amara to climb in first. He paused for a moment, glancing at the officers as they began to drive off, their sirens now silent. The moment he had feared would be over was still hanging over him like a dark cloud. "James," Michelle said softly, pulling him back from his thoughts. "Look at me." He turned and met her eyes. Her expression was a mix of anger and concern. She wasn't angry at him, but at what had just happened. Michelle had always been the one who kept a calm head, the one who could make sense of things when they seemed impossible. But this time, even she was struggling to find the right words. "Why did they do that?" James finally asked, his voice low, almost hollow. "I didn't do anything. I didn't break any laws." "I know," Michelle replied, her voice unwavering. "But that doesn't seem to matter sometimes, does it?" The words stung, even though they were true. James knew it. He had experienced it before, in small, subtle ways, but today was different. Today, it wasn't a glance or a word from a stranger in a store or a comment from a passerby. This time, it had been the police, the people who were supposed to protect him, treating him like he was the one in the wrong. "What are we supposed to do now?" James asked, his voice cracking slightly. "What can we even do? This was just wrong." Michelle's gaze softened, and she placed her hand gently on his. "We're going to do what we always do, we stand together. We don't let them get away with this. You've got your rights, James. They can't just treat you like this without consequence." But even as Michelle said the words, James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be as simple as just standing up for what was right. The world wasn't that simple, especially not for black men in America. He had seen it before, seen people in his community, people who had done nothing wrong, get pulled over, arrested, and even worse, just because of the color of their skin. The police didn't care about fairness. They didn't care about justice. They cared about power. And today, they had shown just how far they were willing to go to assert that power. But Michelle was right, wasn't she? He couldn't just let it go. They couldn't just forget about what had happened. There had to be something they could do, something more than just sitting in silence. But what? The questions kept flooding his mind, and they were quickly overwhelming him. The drive home was quiet. Amara, who had been unusually silent since the incident, eventually spoke up. "Daddy, are you mad at the police?" she asked, her voice small, uncertain. James glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his heart sinking at the question. How was he supposed to explain this to her? How could he explain something like this to a 10-year-old girl who was just trying to make sense of the world? "No, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "I'm not mad. I'm just confused. You know, sometimes things happen that we don't understand. But we'll be okay. Everything's fine now." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. They weren't fine. Things weren't fine. Not after what had happened. He could feel it in his gut. The fear, the injustice, the wrongness of it all, it wasn't going away. It was going to linger, to haunt him for days, weeks, maybe longer. When they arrived home, Michelle didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone and started searching for local news stories about the incident, hoping to find something that could help them understand what had just happened. James, meanwhile, sat down at the kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly as he thought about what to do next. How did he even begin to process this? How could he explain to his daughter that what had just happened wasn't an isolated event, that it was part of a much larger pattern of discrimination and abuse that had plagued their country for generations? Michelle's voice cut through his thoughts. "James, you need to see this." He stood up and walked over to her, peering over her shoulder as she scrolled through her phone. The first headline she showed him read, "Local police under scrutiny after unwarranted arrest of black father." The article detailed the encounter between James and the officers, and it quickly became clear that the situation was being spun in the media as an example of police overreach, an unjustified act that was raising questions about the department's practices. But as James read on, he realized something else: the story was spreading. It was getting attention, not just from local news outlets, but from people across the country. "Maybe this could help," Michelle said, looking up from her phone. "Maybe this could start a conversation." James felt a spark of hope, but it was quickly followed by doubt. What good would this do? Would anyone listen? Would anything actually change? Or would this just be another news cycle, another story that faded away after a few days? And yet, deep down, he knew Michelle was right. Something had to be done. They couldn't let this go. Not for their sake, not just for Amara's, but for every person who had ever been treated unfairly, for every person who had been silenced, overlooked, or discriminated against simply because of who they were. "Maybe we should talk to a lawyer," James said, his voice steady now, the anger from earlier replaced with a quiet determination. Maybe we should make sure that this doesn't happen to anyone else. Michelle nodded, her face set in a determined expression. We're going to make sure that the right thing is done. As the night wore on, James and Michelle talked more, each conversation leading to more questions than answers. The weight of what had happened was heavy, but they knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about them. This was bigger than their family. This was about their community. It was about the kind of world they wanted to live in, the kind of world they wanted to leave for their daughter. They didn't have all the answers yet, but they were going to fight for them. And they were going to start by making sure this story didn't fade into the background like so many others had before it. The fight for justice had just begun. The next morning, the weight of what had happened still hung heavy in the air, like a storm cloud that refused to pass. James had hardly slept. His mind kept replaying the incident from the day before, over and over, trying to find some explanation for why things had gone so terribly wrong. He couldn't shake the image of the officers' faces, their cold eyes as they arrested him. He couldn't forget the way his daughter had looked up at him, her innocent eyes full of confusion and fear. He had tried so hard to protect her from the realities of the world, to shield her from the harshness of a society that didn't always care for people like him. But now, he realized, he couldn't protect her from this. Michelle had spent the night researching their legal options, calling lawyers and reaching out to local civil rights organizations. She was determined to do whatever it took to make sure they weren't just another family who had been wronged and forgotten. As James sat at the kitchen table, the weight of the situation finally sinking in, he realized how much of this was beyond his control. He had always believed in doing the right thing, in following the rules, and in keeping his head down when things got tough. But this wasn't about rules anymore. This was about survival. This was about his family. And that meant he had to fight. Around noon, Michelle received a call from a well-known civil rights lawyer, a woman named Lisa Ramirez. Her name had appeared in news reports many times, always tied to cases where justice had been denied. Lisa's reputation was built on her unwavering commitment to fighting for the rights of marginalized communities. Michelle had reached out to her late the night before, desperate for guidance, and Lisa had agreed to meet with them that afternoon. James had never been a fan of lawyers or the legal system. He had always seen it as a complex, impersonal web that didn't care about people like him. But as the meeting with Lisa approached, he found himself feeling a mix of hope and anxiety. Could this lawyer actually help them? Or was this just another false promise, another story that would fade away without resolution? When Lisa arrived at their home, she immediately put them at ease with her calm demeanor. She was in her mid-40s, dressed professionally but with a warmth in her eyes that made James feel like he was talking to a person, not a suit. She listened carefully as James and Michelle recounted the events of the previous day, detailing everything from the moment they arrived at the school to the arrest itself. Lisa's face remained impassive as she took notes, but James noticed the tightness in her jaw when they mentioned the officer's treatment of him. "This isn't just a case of bad policing," Lisa said after a long pause. "This is a clear violation of your rights, James. And it's part of a much bigger problem that we need to address. You're not alone in this." James had heard those words before, but they didn't feel like empty promises this time. There was something about Lisa's certainty, the way she spoke with the authority of someone who had seen it all, that made him believe her. She wasn't just going to take their case for the publicity or the fee, she truly cared about what had happened. And that made all the difference. "We need to gather as much evidence as possible," Lisa continued. "That means witness statements, video footage, and any records from the police department. The more we have, the stronger our case will be." Michelle nodded, already making plans to contact the people who had witnessed the incident. She had already spoken to a few parents who had seen the entire exchange between James and the officers. Some of them were reluctant to speak up, afraid of retaliation, but others were eager to help. It wasn't easy, but they were determined to make sure the truth came to light. As the afternoon wore on, the mood in the house began to shift. The anger and frustration that had filled their hearts the day before began to transform into something else, something that felt like a spark of resistance. James realized that he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He wasn't even just fighting for his family. He was fighting for every person who had ever been unjustly treated, for every black man who had been pulled over, questioned, or arrested simply because of the color of his skin. He wasn't going to let this go. He couldn't. The next few days passed in a blur. Michelle continued her relentless pursuit of information, contacting everyone who might have had a piece of the puzzle. She spoke with witnesses, reached out to local media outlets, and started a petition that quickly gained traction in the community. People were beginning to take notice of the story, sharing it on social media and spreading the word about the injustice that had occurred. The hashtag Justice for James began trending locally, and more people came forward, each one with a story of their own, each one with a tale of mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. As the story gained momentum, so did the pressure on the police department. The local news stations began covering the incident, and soon, the national media caught wind of it. Stories about the unwarranted arrest of a black father were being shared across the country, sparking conversations about race, police brutality, and the systemic issues that had led to the mistreatment of James. It wasn't just his story anymore, it was the story of so many others who had been pushed to the margins, whose voices had been silenced for far too long. But with the media attention came new challenges. The police department began pushing back, releasing statements defending the actions of the officers involved. They claimed that James had been acting suspiciously and that their actions were justified based on their training and experience. It was the same narrative they had used time and time again: when an officer abuses their power, they hide behind the badge, using it as a shield to deflect blame and responsibility. James felt the weight of it all, the frustration of being painted as the villain in a story that he had never written. But he refused to let the narrative control his life. He knew the truth, and he was going to make sure that everyone else knew it too. One evening, as James sat at the kitchen table, reflecting on everything that had happened, he received a call from Lisa. Her voice was calm, but James could sense the urgency in her tone. "We've got a breakthrough," Lisa said. "A local journalist has come forward with a piece of footage they captured on their phone during the incident. It's shaky, but it shows what happened. It's exactly what we needed." James's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the evidence they had been waiting for. The video would be the key to exposing the truth. The footage wasn't perfect. The camera shook as the person filming tried to stay hidden behind a tree, but it clearly captured the moment James was being arrested. The officer's aggressive behavior was undeniable, and the video confirmed that there had been no reason for James to be detained in the first place. It was proof that he had been targeted because of his race, and now they had it on record. With the new evidence in hand, Lisa went straight to work. She submitted the footage to the court, and it quickly became a focal point of the case. The media picked it up, and soon, everyone was talking about it. The story of a black father, unjustly arrested in front of his daughter, became a symbol of the broader issues that were plaguing the community and the country. But even as things began to look more promising, James knew that this fight was far from over. The road ahead would be long, and it would be filled with obstacles. But he also knew that it was a fight worth fighting, not just for him, but for every person who had ever been treated unfairly by the system. This was his moment. And he was going to make sure that his voice, and the voices of so many others, were finally heard. The weeks that followed felt like an unrelenting storm for James and Michelle. Every day was filled with new challenges, new obstacles, and, at times, overwhelming exhaustion. But the pressure didn't deter them. If anything, it only strengthened their resolve. The media storm was now in full force, with local and national outlets picking up the story. The footage of James' arrest, shaky as it was, had ignited a firestorm of discussion on social media and across news platforms. The hashtag Justice for James continued to trend, gaining attention from activists, celebrities, and community leaders, all calling for accountability. At first, James had felt like a reluctant symbol, caught up in something much bigger than he ever intended. But as the days passed, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something far more significant, about the fight for justice, for fairness, and for equal treatment under the law. Each morning, James would wake up to another barrage of news stories, tweets, and messages. Some were supportive, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. Others were dismissive, questioning whether the arrest had really been racially motivated or blaming him for causing a scene. It wasn't easy to read, but James had learned to focus on the messages that mattered, the ones that supported him and his family, the ones that echoed his own experience of racial injustice. And those messages were coming in from every corner of the country. Michelle, ever the determined force, was also receiving her fair share of attention. She had become a voice for their cause, speaking to reporters and standing up in public forums to ensure that their story wasn't silenced. She wasn't just advocating for James, but for every black father who had ever felt the sting of prejudice, for every mother who had watched her child face unjust treatment, and for every person who had ever been afraid to speak out against the system. Her courage was undeniable, and soon, she was being invited to participate in discussions and panels about racial justice and police reform. James watched as Michelle continued to navigate the media frenzy with poise and grace. There were times when he wanted to shield her from it all, to protect her from the constant barrage of questions and scrutiny. But deep down, he knew this was her fight too. It was their fight. And even though it was exhausting, they were in it together. But not everything was going smoothly. The police department, caught in the spotlight of the case, began to push back. They issued public statements defending the actions of the officers involved, reiterating their stance that James had been acting suspiciously and refused to comply. They even tried to paint him as an aggressor, claiming that they had been forced to arrest him due to his hostile behavior. It was a classic deflection, the kind of narrative the police often used to protect their own. But this time, it wasn't working. The more the department tried to spin the story, the more people saw through it. The video footage was damning, and the truth was out there for everyone to see. Despite the department's attempts to control the narrative, public support for James was growing. There were protests in the streets, organized by local community groups, demanding justice for James and an end to police brutality. These protests weren't just about his arrest, they were about the broader issue of systemic racism in law enforcement, about the countless lives that had been affected by the same prejudices that had led to James' encounter with the police. James wasn't the only one who had faced this. There were so many others. And finally, people were standing up and speaking out. The growing momentum of the protests only added more fuel to the fire. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't escalate further, the unexpected happened. One afternoon, a video surfaced. It was a clip from a dashcam video, taken from one of the police cruisers that had been parked nearby during the arrest. In it, the officers could be heard talking amongst themselves, laughing as they described the incident. "Yeah, I told him to get out of the car. He didn't like that," one officer said, followed by a chuckle. "He's just another one of those guys who thinks he's above the law." The video sent shockwaves through the community, igniting even more outrage. It was clear that the officers involved hadn't been acting out of concern for public safety, they had been acting out of prejudice. They had seen James, a black man, and immediately made assumptions about him based on the color of his skin. The dashcam video wasn't just proof of their callousness, it was confirmation of everything James had feared. The system wasn't just broken, it was corrupt. And it was time to demand accountability. The video went viral, and within hours, calls for the officers to be fired began to pour in from all corners of the country. Local politicians, community leaders, and activists took to the streets, demanding that the officers involved be held accountable for their actions. Even some law enforcement officials, appalled by what they had seen, spoke out against the officers' behavior. It was a turning point, a moment when the truth could no longer be denied. But while the public outrage was mounting, James couldn't help but feel conflicted. As the case gained more attention, the pressure on him grew. Every time he walked outside, every time he went to the store, he felt like he was being watched. People on the street recognized him, some offering their support, others casting judgment. It was a strange feeling, being thrust into the public eye like this. He had never wanted to be a public figure, but now, he was the face of something much bigger than himself. And then, there was the question of his family. Amara had started asking difficult questions, things that James wasn't sure how to answer. "Daddy, why did they arrest you?" she asked one night, her innocent eyes filled with confusion. "What did you do wrong?" James had tried to explain to her as best as he could, though the words seemed to fall short. "Sometimes, people treat us unfairly because of the color of our skin, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we don't let that stop us. We stand up for what's right, and we make sure we're heard." Michelle had been the one who held Amara when the questions became too difficult to answer, comforting their daughter as she processed the reality of the situation. James was grateful for Michelle's strength. She had always known how to navigate difficult conversations with their daughter, always able to explain things in a way that made sense to her. But this was different. This wasn't something you could explain away. This was a harsh truth about the world they lived in, a truth that James wasn't sure he was ready to face. As the days wore on, the case continued to gain traction. More and more people were joining the fight for justice. Protests were being organized across the country, with people of all races standing together to demand accountability for the officers who had treated James so unjustly. It was a movement now, not just a case. It was a demand for change, for a world where black lives were valued, where justice was truly blind. But even as the movement grew, James knew that the battle wasn't over. The road ahead was still long and filled with challenges. The police department was pushing back harder than ever, doing everything they could to discredit the case and shift the blame. James and Michelle both knew that the real fight had only just begun. The police may have underestimated them, but they weren't backing down. They were going to make sure that the voices of the unheard were finally heard. They were going to make sure that justice was served, not just for James, but for everyone who had ever been treated like a second-class citizen because of the color of their skin. And as they stood together, stronger than ever, they knew one thing for certain: they were not going to let this moment pass without making a difference. It wasn't just about one arrest, one family, it was about the future, about creating a world where justice truly meant justice for all. The intensity of the fight for justice only escalated as weeks turned into months. The community continued to rally around James, Michelle, and their family, but now the focus had shifted from just one arrest to a broader movement aimed at reforming the very system that had allowed such an incident to occur. The media coverage of the arrest had sparked a nationwide conversation about race, policing, and systemic injustice, with protests becoming a regular fixture in cities all over the country. From peaceful marches to passionate speeches, the movement was growing, fueled by a collective desire for change. James could hardly believe the level of attention their story had garnered. He'd never imagined that a simple, everyday trip to pick up his daughter would lead to such widespread scrutiny, but he knew now that this moment had become something much larger. At first, he had been overwhelmed by the weight of the attention, by the cameras, the endless interviews, and the people constantly seeking his opinion. It had all felt like too much. But over time, he had come to understand that the attention wasn't just for him, it was for everyone who had experienced the same kind of injustice, the same systemic abuse that had defined the lives of so many black people in this country. He realized that he had a responsibility to use his platform for something bigger than himself. Michelle, ever the steadfast partner, had been the driving force behind the campaign for justice from the start. Her resolve never wavered, even as the pressure mounted. As James retreated into the background, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of it all, Michelle stepped up to the forefront. She spoke at rallies, joined panel discussions, and worked with legal teams to ensure their case wasn't forgotten. She knew that this wasn't just about fighting for their own dignity, it was about fighting for the dignity of every person who had been wronged by the system. Despite the growing support, not everyone was on their side. The local police department, backed by some influential city officials, tried to brush the whole incident under the rug. They hired high-powered attorneys who worked tirelessly to discredit James and Michelle, digging into their pasts, searching for anything that could be used to undermine their credibility. It was a strategy designed to exhaust them, to wear them down so that they would eventually give up and let the issue fade away. But James and Michelle were not going to be intimidated. They had seen firsthand what silence and submission could lead to, and they weren't about to let the system sweep this under the rug. The legal battle was long and grueling, with both sides presenting their cases in court. James had been charged with resisting arrest, a charge that many believed was fabricated to justify the officer's actions. The prosecution was trying to paint him as an aggressor, but the video footage of his arrest, along with the damning dashcam footage of the officer's casual conversation, painted a different picture entirely. The truth was on their side, but it was a painful truth to confront. In court, the defense team for the officers worked to redirect the attention onto James' character. They tried to insinuate that he had been acting suspiciously, that he had been uncooperative, even though all evidence suggested otherwise. They also tried to discredit Michelle's statements, accusing her of exaggerating the situation for attention. But it was clear that their defense was a weak one. The more the officers' defense team spoke, the more their own actions came into question. Despite the mounting pressure, James and Michelle never wavered. They spent long hours together, discussing strategy and preparing for the long days in court. They knew this battle would take everything they had, but they were determined to see it through. They also knew they weren't just fighting for themselves. Every day, they received letters and messages from people all over the world, telling them their stories of discrimination, of feeling powerless in a system stacked against them. These stories fueled James and Michelle, reminding them of the stakes, reminding them of the lives that had been lost to injustice. As the trial progressed, it became evident that the case wasn't just about one arrest. It was about a larger issue, one that could no longer be ignored. The stories of other families affected by police violence began to come to light, and soon, the courtroom was filled with testimonies from people who had experienced similar situations. The case had become a symbol of the struggle against systemic racism, and people were watching with bated breath. What would the outcome be? Would justice prevail, or would the status quo win once again? Michelle took the stand, her voice unwavering as she recounted the details of that fateful day. Her testimony was powerful, heartfelt, and raw. She spoke not just as a wife and mother, but as a voice for the voiceless. She described the fear she had felt when she saw James being dragged away, and the heartbreak of trying to explain to her daughter why her father had been treated so cruelly. It was a moment that left many in the courtroom in tears. It wasn't just a mother's pain, it was the pain of an entire community, the pain of all those who had been silenced for far too long. James was next. He took the stand with a quiet strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep within. He spoke of his experiences with the police, his feelings of fear and helplessness as he was arrested for simply picking up his daughter. He didn't hold back. He spoke truth to power, detailing the systemic failures that had led to his arrest and the countless others like him. His words were unflinching, his voice steady. He wasn't just telling his story, he was telling the story of an entire generation. The trial dragged on for weeks, but as the evidence mounted, it became clear that the officers' actions were indefensible. The prosecution's case was strong, and public opinion was shifting in favor of James and Michelle. The tide was turning, but it wasn't over yet. There were still those who wanted to see James and Michelle fail, who wanted to protect the system that had allowed this to happen. But with each passing day, the pressure on the officers and their department grew. The calls for justice became louder, the protests more frequent. People were demanding change, and they were ready to fight for it. Then, the moment of reckoning arrived. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. James and Michelle sat in silence, hands tightly clasped together, waiting for the verdict that would determine the course of their lives. The room was thick with tension. The minutes dragged on, stretching into hours, as they waited for justice to be served. And when the jury finally returned, the verdict was read aloud: guilty. The officers had been found guilty of violating James' civil rights, of using excessive force in his arrest. The court had spoken, and the officers were held accountable. In the days that followed, there was a sense of both relief and disbelief. James and Michelle had won. The officers were fired, and the department was forced to undergo sweeping reforms. The case had not only brought justice to one family but had also ignited a movement that could no longer be ignored. Change was coming, slowly but surely. But for James and Michelle, the victory wasn't just about the verdict, it was about the future. It was about their daughter, Amara, and the world they hoped she would grow up in, a world where justice truly meant justice for all. They knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be more battles to fight, more struggles to endure. But for the first time in a long while, they felt hope. They felt like they were part of something bigger, something that could change the world. As they walked out of the courtroom, hand in hand, they knew one thing for sure: they had made a difference. And that was all that mattered. The days after the verdict were filled with a complex mix of emotions: relief, triumph, and yet, an overwhelming sense of responsibility. James and Michelle had won the battle, but the war for justice, for true equality, was far from over. They had become symbols of resilience and hope for those who felt voiceless in a system that seemed to continually fail them. But now, they had to navigate the reality of their victory. The fight was not only about securing justice for one incident, it was about creating lasting change, challenging the system that had perpetuated these injustices for generations. While the immediate aftermath brought a sense of justice, it also introduced new challenges. With the public focus now on their story, James and Michelle found themselves at the center of a larger conversation, one that had taken on a life of its own. The media attention, while initially a source of stress and exhaustion, had also become a tool for change. The couple was constantly approached by activists, community leaders, and even lawmakers, all wanting to know how they could help further the cause. While the attention felt overwhelming, James and Michelle knew that they had the power to influence the conversation. In the months following the trial, they traveled across the country, speaking at rallies, attending town hall meetings, and participating in panels dedicated to police reform and racial justice. They had become two of the most outspoken advocates for change, not just because of their own story but because of the many untold stories that they carried with them. Every speech, every interview was a reminder of the importance of what they were doing. They weren't just talking about one arrest, they were talking about a movement, about the need to address systemic racism and hold law enforcement accountable for their actions. The path they were walking was fraught with difficulty. James, in particular, often struggled with the weight of it all. He had never been a public figure, and while he was grateful for the support, the constant spotlight began to take a toll on him. He missed the days when his life was simple, when he could go to work, pick up his daughter from school, and go home without worrying about being recognized or scrutinized. The endless interviews, the requests for public appearances, and the constant pressure to be a representative of the cause became exhausting. He sometimes found himself longing for peace, for the quiet life they once had. But Michelle, ever the force of nature, continued to push forward, determined to use the platform they had gained for good. She knew that the battle didn't stop with the verdict, it was just the beginning. She pushed for legislative changes, meeting with lawmakers and policy experts to advocate for bills that would implement police reform and provide more accountability for law enforcement. She knew that the system had to change, and she wasn't going to stop until it did. Meanwhile, the community around them was changing as well. The protests that had initially sparked in the wake of James' arrest continued, but now they had a renewed focus. People were no longer just protesting police brutality, they were advocating for policy changes, for reforms that would ensure the kind of injustice James had faced wouldn't happen again. New organizations dedicated to reform were created, and existing ones grew exponentially, fueled by the momentum of James and Michelle's story. The call for a national reckoning with police practices was stronger than ever, and people from all walks of life were joining the fight. But for James and Michelle, the fight was deeply personal. While they were advocates for change, they were also parents. They had to balance their activism with raising their daughter, Amara, who was growing up in a world that was slowly, but undoubtedly, changing. Amara, who had witnessed her father's arrest and the ripple effects it had on their lives, had become a symbol of the next generation. In a way, her innocence and the purity of her questions, "Why did they arrest you, Daddy?" had brought the reality of the situation into sharp focus. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and interviews, Michelle sat with Amara at the kitchen table, helping her with her homework. The young girl, always inquisitive, asked another question that had been on her mind. "Mommy, are we done fighting yet?" Michelle looked at her daughter, her heart heavy with the weight of that simple question. It was a question she didn't have a straightforward answer to, but she did her best to explain. "Sweetheart, the fight for justice is never truly over. But we've made a lot of progress, and together, we're helping to make the world better for you, for everyone." She smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "One day, you'll understand how important this is. And when you do, you'll know that you were a part of something much bigger than all of us." Amara's eyes lit up. "I want to help, too." "You already are," Michelle said, brushing a stray lock of hair from her daughter's face. "Just by being you, just by learning and growing, you're helping to create a better world." But even as they worked tirelessly for change, James couldn't help but worry about the long-term effects of their fight. Was it enough to change the system, or would their efforts eventually fall into the same pattern of broken promises and unfulfilled reforms? The case had brought attention to the issue, but James knew it wasn't just about shining a light on the problem, it was about sustained, meaningful action. One day, a breakthrough came. A major national movement advocating for police reform, one that had gained momentum in the months following James' case, proposed a comprehensive bill designed to overhaul police training, implement community policing initiatives, and create independent oversight bodies to investigate complaints of police misconduct. The bill was gaining traction in Congress, with increasing bipartisan support, and it included many of the reforms that James and Michelle had been pushing for. They were invited to Washington to speak in favor of the bill, and it was a moment that brought everything full circle. James and Michelle had started this journey not as activists but as parents and ordinary citizens caught in an extraordinary circumstance. And now, they were at the forefront of a national conversation about justice. Standing before the Senate committee, Michelle spoke passionately about the need for systemic change. She shared their story, but she also shared the stories of countless others who had been wronged by the system. She spoke not just for James, but for the entire community, for all those who had faced discrimination and injustice. "This bill," she said, "is not just about changing the law, it's about changing lives. It's about ensuring that every child, regardless of their skin color, grows up in a world where they feel safe, where they are treated with dignity and respect." The room was silent as she finished her speech, and when the applause came, it was deafening. This was more than just a victory for James and Michelle. It was a victory for all those who had ever been made to feel small, for all those who had been oppressed, for every voice that had been silenced by the system. And it was a victory that could create lasting change. In the end, the bill passed, and James and Michelle returned home, their hearts filled with pride and exhaustion. They knew the work was far from over. There would always be more battles to fight, more obstacles to overcome. But in that moment, they allowed themselves to feel a deep sense of accomplishment. They had fought for justice, and together, they had won. Their story, their struggle, had sparked something that could not be extinguished. It was a movement now, and it was stronger than ever. As they sat in their living room that evening, watching Amara play, James turned to Michelle. "We did it. We really did it." Michelle smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "No, James. We did it together. And now, we make sure it continues, for Amara, for all of us." They knew that this wasn't the end, but the beginning of something far greater. Their fight had ignited a spark, and that spark would continue to grow, lighting the way for future generations to come. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the love of their family, they knew that they had made a difference. They had changed the world, not just for themselves, but for everyone. And they would never stop fighting until justice was truly served for all.